Last April 13th, the little resort and railroad town of Keddie in remote Plumas County hit the headlines. The county awoke with horror that Monday morning. There had been committed there a crime so bizarre it should have happened in the big city. Indeed, it was the reason most Keddie residents had moved to the country to escape crime. On that spring day, then Plumas County Sheriff Doug Thomas found the bodies of 36-year-old Glenna Sharp, her 16-year-old son John, his 17-year-old friend Dana Wingate. They had been knifed and claw-hammered to death.
November 1980 is when we moved into Keddie in a small cabin, which was number 28. Rick Gregg slept in one room. My mom, Tina, and I slept in another room. And Johnny, there was a basement downstairs, and since he was building, he got to sleep down there. Johnny had scruffy blonde, I think dirty blonde hair. He had blue eyes, and he was small like the rest of us. But don't get me wrong, he made up in that. He was very, very feisty. And I think that night, that's what happened to him, was he was defending the family, which he would do at any cost. He always stuck up for me at school or wherever for any of us. And I think that's what happened that night, was he was defending Mom and Tina and the rest of the family.
The scene was horrible beyond belief as Sheila Sharp looked through the window of her mother's house in Keddie, California. Inside, on the living room floor, lay the corpses of her mother, her brother, and his friend. All had been tortured and viciously murdered. The bodies remained bound and gagged. Dead were 36-year-old Glenna Sharp, the mother of 5. Her son, 15-year-old John Sharp, a student at Quincy High School. His friend from school, 17-year-old Dana Wingate. No one is quite sure what happened on that April night in 1981, but police investigators believe the 2 boys may have been picked up by the suspects as they hitchhiked home from Quincy, 7 miles away. The 2 boys were laying prone on the floor, had been tied up, and then on the couch was Sue.
The mother was the type who had a lot of men friends, constant comings and goings, as I understand it. You know, everyone knew that the family was on welfare, and in those days that was not a popular thing to have happen to you here in Plumas County. And so you immediately had sort of a stigmatism attached to you. You know, there were a lot of rumors at the time about, my gosh, the way she deals drugs, it could be anybody, it could have been a big drug party that got out of hand. Some of the rumors dealt with her sleeping with various men for money.
My aunt, when she was murdered, was my age now, and she was a single mother of 5 children, and she had 2 teenagers, a preteen, and then 2 small boys. And she uprooted her family, moved here to be near family, my dad, and try to make the best of what she could with the skills she had.
I didn't feel any better about Sue then because I just felt like I was very judgmental and thought she should have been a better mother. And I wouldn't let my kids go over there, but I was welcoming her kid over to our house and wanted them to be there and be safe. But the night it happened, they wanted Paula to stay the night, and I wouldn't let her stay. And I just felt like my kids didn't belong over there.
My aunt, of all people, my cousin, Johnny, my Aunt Sue, Dana, and Tina, they were nobody. They weren't people that were harassing the shopkeepers in Quincy. I don't believe they were the neighbors that were creating discontent amongst the neighborhood. They kept to themselves. Nobody knew them. They weren't notorious. Yet out of the blue, those 4 people were murdered in this town.
It changed the face of Plumas County because nothing had ever happened before. And because nothing like that had ever happened before, it made people a little scared and a little suspicious. And I've been here 30 years, and after that happened, I don't pick up hitchhikers anymore unless I know them. And my mom's still sending me articles in the paper she sees about the Katie murders. It was a real upset up here, and everyone still feels bad about the whole situation. And I can't believe she still, every time she sees something in the paper, she'll send me up an article about it. And I'm still like to get to the bottom of this one, you know. It made the area just less innocent than it was before. It was like nothing was ever the same after that.
It didn't just affect Ketty, it affected all of Quincy, all of our county, because who would have thought that there's something this horrific could happen in a small mountain community like this? It's God's country.
Dana, was born prematurely. I believe, my memory puts me right. I think 7.5 months. Right from the start, we had troubles physically with him, and that carried on through his years, even as becoming a teenager. Through those years, Dana, and the whole family, I worked a lot, so it was a joke that none of my kids knew me. Who's that? Well, that's your father.
We used to take Dana and dress him up in Annie's clothes, and he had longer hair because that was the style back then. We would braid up his hair and put makeup on him, and my dad would get so mad because there was 3 girls and 1 boy, so he wanted his son, and we would try to make him look like us. And then we'd go, "Smile, Peaches, smile," and then we would all laugh, and he was just precious.
Dana was, I think, more and more, he felt the distance, and it became more and more interested in being outside of the family, just staying away. And my girls are always staying at home. And he, as I look back at it, he was spending more time out of the house with friends and all that.
My wife and I operated a receiving home for the county of Plumas. During the time that we were there, Dana Wingy became one of our clients. Living in the group home, Dana had the responsibility of keeping my wife and I informed of where it was at all times. So due to his responsibility, he came to the house on the afternoon of the terrible incident that occurred, and he and Johnny asked if Dana could go to Johnny's that evening and spend the night. And with the proviso, my wife insisted that they not hitchhike down to 7 miles to Ketty. But as we know now, that's exactly what they ended up doing. The next morning, at about 10 o'clock in the morning or so, we got a call from the police, and they asked us to come to the mortuary to identify a body. And we went down, and they were very nice to us, told us what to expect. And we went in, and much to our dismay, the body was that Dana.
I believe it was something to do with the mother. I believe that. I mean, to be that brutal with these people, you know, something was going on.
Even though this event happened over 20 years ago, Dana has been with me, with the rest of my family, and with the other kids that were in that home during that entire time. I've talked to some of the others, and they recall what they feel about Dana. And there just is no end to this. It goes on and on and on. We don't feel like we have to quit living or live in that past, but it's always with us.
When I went over to Alicia's that night, in the night, I didn't know where Tina was. She could have been outside playing or, you know, at the house. Who knows at this time. I do know that she wanted to spend the night, but Alicia and I wanted it just to be the older girls, nobody else. We were being stingy, I guess. I remember Tina and Sheila coming over, and Sheila was going to stay all night with my daughter, Alicia. And Tina wanted to stay, and she stayed every Saturday night. And so I just thought it would be really nice if Sheila stayed by herself that night.
Tina was just beautiful. She had blonde hair that was kind of shoulder length and kind of unkept, but it looked good. You know, it was kind of like she was a free spirit, if you will. She had these incredible, huge blue eyes that kind of overpowered her whole self. I mean, that's what captured you when you looked at her. You didn't see really her hair or anything like that. You were just captivated by her eyes.
I remember Tina as being a little bit slow at school. She was in special education classes, and that's how I can relate to her being slow, because she was a normal kid to me.
As a student, Tina was not at grade level. She was in a special ed class and getting extra help. I would help her one-on-one, but she really didn't get the help that she needed at home. She was struggling with everything. But she was one of the sweetest, nicest little girls I think I've ever had.
When I walked in the house that morning, what I saw was a person right at the door with their hands and feet tied. I dropped all my, I guess I had sleeping bag, clothes right there and ran back to People's where I stayed the night before.
She was back in just a few minutes and she was just screaming and crying hysterically. She says, "My God, there's 3 dead people in my house." And she didn't know who they were. And I ran across the street to we didn't have a phone, and I ran across to the people that owned the house, owned Ketty at the time, and I had them call the sheriff.
One of the things I did see as well was a knife, which I thought at the time was a pocket knife, and come to find out it was a bent steak knife that they had used on, I don't know if all of them or one of them. After the police were called, we then ran back next to my house to the side window where Rick, Craig, and Justin were sleeping and got them out through the window. I did not want them to see what I saw, and who knows if somebody else was still in the house at the time.
And apparently the bodies are pretty hard to tell who's, they were bashed in so bad or something to that effect. What amazes me is that the kids sleeping in the bedroom didn't hear a thing. How can that be?
There's a very good chance that I had witnessed something, whether it be the crime itself or the aftermath. The morning after the crime had occurred, after the police arrived, I was being interviewed by Doug Thomas, and he conducted the interview inside of his patrol car, probably because it was raining out and we didn't want to be exposed to the elements. I had made several remarks in reference to where is Tina? Tina's missing, and the sheriff or the detective was not acknowledging any of the statements that I was saying, and he actually had to be interrupted by my mother and told, "Will you be quiet for a moment and listen to what this boy is telling you? He is telling you that Tina is missing."
What Justin was saying was, no, that is not Tina in there, that's Sue in there. And to go look for Tina. Tina's missing. He kept saying that over and over. Tina's missing.
Well, we're trying to locate Tina. We believe that she's an integral part of this and that she may be the clue that we're looking for. She's a girl of 12 years of age with shoulder-length hair. It's dark blonde in color, and she has light blue eyes. She's very slightly built, and one would maybe mistake her for a 9-year-old.
Are you going on the assumption that she has been kidnapped or run away?
Well, we know that she was in the residence, and at this point we have to go into the assumption that the assailant or assailants took her with them.
I just assumed that somebody took her because she was so pretty, and that they just wanted her to be their own. And I had no idea at that time. I was so naive that anything horrible could happen. But I just figured, they wanted her so badly that they would do anything to have her.
When the Ketty murders happened, Tina was not found. They didn't know where she was. And I went out looking for her. I always thought that if she were alive, she would come to me. She knew where I lived. She knew I cared about her. And she never came. So I was out traveling around the mountains, and I'd get in my car and I'd go down the canyon, and I'd go into all the little roads and streets roads down there, just seeing if I could find something. I still can't go down the canyon without thinking about Tina.
For Plumas County, the Ketty murders were indeed a shock. After all, this county only has 17,000 people, only 33 sworn officers, and at one point, 1/5 of those investigators were working on the Ketty murder and kidnap.
Politics played a big role in the whole thing. We had a sheriff that was trying to make probably more of a name for himself, and rather than relying on the expertise of the Department of Justice when it first started out, he tried to do things himself, and I think hurt the case quite a bit.
We collected evidence from throughout the room and from throughout the house, actually. Anything that we could believe that had a connection with the homicide. We even tore some panels off the wall because there was some blood there. And then all of that was sent to the Department of Justice in Sacramento for analyzation. The most kind of strange thing for me was that the walls, forward and backward, of that room had knife marks, like somebody had been throwing a knife, trying to stick it in the wall. At the time, I had been using hypnosis. I'd gone to 2 different training sessions to learn hypnosis to get recall from witnesses. We took Justin and put him under hypnosis, and under hypnosis, Justin didn't actually say that he saw anything, but he described watching Love Boat, and then in detail talked about the fight, and talked about Sue, and talked about at the end that Sue was thrown overboard.
I had indicated body placements, which were, from what I understand, very close to being correct, if not correct.
He heard the loud noises, the scuffles, the noises that were being, made in the living room, and he was probably peeking out from behind the bedroom door.
Police artists have drawn these composite sketches of the 2 suspects. If you know anything about these murders or recognize the men in these drawings, call 1-800-78-CRIME. Help put these men behind bars. They are 2 of California's most wanted.
When I saw the composites, I did see my ex-husband in those composites, as well as a man that he had met over in the VA mental hospital.
Now, these are the pictures that came out in the newspaper of the people they thought had done the murder or committed the murder. And we had noticed that if you took the top half of one guy and put it with the bottom half of the other guy's face, and it was almost a carbon copy of Bo and Marty. And this is what it would look like on one, and kind of like that on the other one. Mm-hmm.
Martin Smart lived just around the corner, like maybe 3 houses away, 2 to 3 houses, but just around the corner. And Bo was a friend of his, and it's my understanding that they had met at the VA hospital and developed a friendship. And of course, the night of the homicide, they had visited the bar in the hotel, and people just were suspicious of them.
He wanted to stop in and see if Sue would go down to the lounge with us. And I tried to tell him no, that she wouldn't go. She doesn't drink. She's not that way. And he said, well, Bo needs a partner. And I said, well, she won't go. And he insisted, you go and talk. You go ask her. And so I said, well, okay, I'll go ask her. But she won't go. And I did. I went and asked. And she didn't want to go. And so they were both upset about that. I did wake up. It was oh, it had to have been probably 2 in the morning or so. And I heard noise, and I did get up and I went to the bedroom door, and I saw them burning something in the wood stove.
Well, Marty had went to Reno the day after the murder, and he come home about 5, 6 o'clock. It was like in the afternoon, and he was real high on something. And he kept saying, well, I got to go to Ketty. I got to go to Ketty. And I'd say, Marty, you don't need to go to Ketty. Somebody's out there killing somebody, and you don't need to be going. And he says, well, I got to go. And he was walking up and down the room, up and down the room. He says, I got to go. There's something I got to finish. Something I started that had to be finished. I've got to go finish it. And I kept arguing with him. He said, Marty, you don't need to go. I'll take you in the morning. But he kept saying that over and over. I got to go back. I got to go there. Something I got to finish. Something I started. Something I got to finish. I have to go. And I finally talked to him about 9 o'clock at night. I talked to him into saying, he says, okay. He said, I'll stay. But all that evening, he was just walked just like a caged animal, walking up and down, and repeating himself. And sometimes, about 4 o'clock in the morning, he got up and left. And he was, I guess, to Ketty.
What do you think he might have been? Why do you think he needed to go down there?
Well, I think that maybe he knew where Tina was. I think that maybe he left some evidence there that he had to get rid of.
We went to the Smart residence and, with their permission, searched the residence in an outbuilding, looking for any kind of clues that might, connect them to the crime. And then Department of Justice had some agents assigned to the case, and they extensively interviewed both Bo and Martin. And then myself and Ken Shanks, we interviewed them. We went to great detail to make sure in our own minds that they were not involved.
They were going through the cupboards. Marty was a chef, and he had all kinds of knives and so forth. They found, I guess they found like duct tape. They found his knives and stuff. I think one was missing, or somebody found a hangman's noose that was way up on top. They found Hustler magazine that I didn't even know existed. They found a jacket down under the house that belonged to Tina that had some blood on it. They also found the kids had, there was a little shack just up the road and from our cabin, and the kids had a little clubhouse type thing in there. And the police, when I went out to get some clothing, the detectives and the sheriffs and deputies that met me out there, and we went up to the clubhouse, and I noticed something that I know wasn't like that before, and I questioned whether Tina might have been held there because the floorboards were torn up. And I know the kids can do it. We asked. And it wasn't like that when I had been out there that weekend. But the floorboard was torn up, and we kind of wonder if maybe that's what Tina had been.
Marty was always calling on the phone with little tidbits of information. Normally, they were things that were designed to throw the suspicion somewhere else. Yeah, there were several things that brought some suspicion to Tina. The fact that the wires that were used to tie the boys came from Tina's bedroom. Of course, she shared that with Sue. And then in doing an examination of everything in the house, we learned that a shoebox that had been made as a school project was missing from the kitchen. And we found that really strange. There was nothing else really missing from the house other than that shoebox. And we learned that Tina had a real liking or fixation on that tool or that shoebox. And we just assumed that when she left, that shoebox went with her. And to my knowledge, that shoebox has never been recovered.
I believe it to be approximately 2 days after the crime occurred. I was talking to my brother, and this is a story that my mother tells me. I was speaking with my brother, and I was telling him some details, not details, I was talking to him about the crime.
Casey and Justin were playing on the floor. I remember that. I don't remember what day. It was just right after it, though. And I caught Justin saying, "No, Casey, you have to do it this way." And he was having Casey stabbing. He said, "Because I have to stop your arm." And so Casey was supposed to try and stab him, and then he would grab his arm to stop him. And then I couldn't believe what I was seeing, and Justin was saying, "I have to protect Sue, I have to protect Sue." And then Marty, he grabbed Justin, and he jerked him up, and he said, "You will never talk about this again, ever." And he took him outside, and I don't know what was said to Justin outside. But Justin didn't talk to him about it again. After Marty threatened him, is when he shut everything down. Up to that point, he was talking to Doug. But then when I think Marty caused him to forget, because we are almost certain he knew that Tina was gone. He knew she was missing. He knew that the female out there was Sue. He knew that it was Johnny. He knew that it was Dana. All of the blood, the glass, all of that. He could describe all that stuff. So either he walked to the scene after the fact, or he could have been standing. The way it was situated, he could have been standing in the little hall next to the doorway and could have seen it all. Tina would have had to come all the way down the hall where he was. And his tennis shoes, they took his tennis shoes, and they told him that there was evidence that he had walked through the scene on those tennis shoes. We don't know what happened to those tennis shoes.
The Kitty homicide has always been an important case as far as I was concerned, but didn't get as much attention as I think it should have.
How I found out about Tina was my kids went to church and they found out about it at church. And just as soon as they could get to a telephone, they called me and told me what had happened.
We were on a trip with my youth group in California when my foster dad, who was also one of the youth leaders, took myself and my cousins aside and informed me that they found Tina. And at that time we were, I got all excited. Well, where is she? Can we see her now? And come find out she was dead.
The condition of her body at the time that was discovered left very little for us to use to determine, what may or may not have happened to her. There were some skeletal remains, and that was it. Those didn't produce anything like um, knife cuts on the bones or crushed in skull or something like that. None of that was present. So still today, well, I don't think we can honestly say what she actually died from.
Who was she? Who was Tina? She was an 11, 12-year-old girl who lived here in Keddie, California for a very short time and attended school in Quincy. That was, I mean, there's 12 years of history here somewhere. There's a little girl who had a life before she was murdered.
I did go back to Quincy in the late 80s to visit some friends, and then I also at that time went and visited my mom and everybody's grave. And I noticed at that time Tina had a little tin plaque that disappointed me greatly, knowing that Mom Johnny had a decent one, but Tina didn't, and there was nothing I could do at that time to fix it. First of all, thanks everybody for coming to this. It has been a long time coming for Tina. Tina, as you guys can tell, she's our little angel. She's always, I know, looked over us and our family, helped us get where we are today. And this is also to help Tina put her at rest. She didn't have this. She was a joy. I miss her. She was my best friend. I miss my sister. And I want everybody to know that she's well loved and she's in our hearts. She always will be. She's looking over us and in our prayers. I can't get everybody.
I don't know that I have a whole bunch to say, but Sue was her name is Glenna, and mine is too. That was odd anyway, but she was called Sue, and I was her best friend, and all my children and all her children were like brothers and sisters. They lived at my house or her house, and Tina and all of them. And Johnny was my boy's best friend, but he was like one of my own children, and so was Sheila. And Sheila and I have a special bond because Sheila has a daughter named Melissa. She's here somewhere. And that is also my granddaughter. And unfortunately, I didn't meet her until today. So anyway, it happened a long, long time ago. And, the image kind of drifts out of your mind, but you don't ever forget. Never. And all the horror that child must have went through. And I'm glad they found her, and I'm glad it's coming to a close.
Okay, we've kind of moved it a little bit, but
and I think you've seen it before. But the timeline pretty much starts here with, look at the date that it actually starts. It even has stuff mentioned from June of 1980, and then starts working through with, some of the victims involved and other, people that could be involved to where it reaches, the time that the homicide occurs, and then some of the investigation that was done afterwards. And I think just where just some information they got while the investigation was going on, that just may kind of set the stage for certain things or possibilities.
When they released him from jail, he was told not to come around Namika's house, not to notify me. He was told basically, get out of town. I've got to back up a little bit. My daughter was living with us for a while. She was terrified of him, and I didn't know this. But she ran away. And she went back up to Oregon with her stepmother because of him. And after all this happened, she received a phone call up there, and she does not know who called her. But it was the same night that, the next night after it happened, she received a phone call up there telling her that she could be next if she didn't keep her mouth shut, which scared her to death. She has no idea who it was that called, because at that point, they didn't even know anything about it up there. I received a postcard, and this was many months later, like 6, 7 months later. I received a postcard saying all it said was, Bo is dead. Marty, that's all it said. I don't know how he died. I know that it came from Portland, Oregon. I'm assuming that's where they were at.
It's just the idea that at least 2 people committed this crime, and it's just bothersome to know that they're still not apprehended, that they're still out there. If they were capable of committing such a heinous crime in 81, I suppose 22 years ago, it's just amazing that they haven't committed some other ones since then.
This is Sue Sharp, who was found stabbed to death in her home in Keddie, California, on the morning of April 12, 1981. Her hands and feet were tied, her mouth gagged with a blue bandana. Her body was found covered with a sheet and a blanket. She was 36 years old. Sue suffered multiple injuries, including lacerations and bruising on her face, stab wounds to her chest and throat, fractures of her teeth, and cuts on both of her hands. This is Sue's son, John Sharp. His body was found a few feet from his mother's, his hands and feet bound with tape and electrical cord. He had been beaten and stabbed in the throat. He was 15 years old. Like his mother, he suffered multiple skull fractures and lacerations. This is Johnny's best friend, Dana Wingate. His body was found on the floor in between Sue and John. Tape was wrapped around one hand and electrical cord wrapped around one foot, but he was not bound. His head was resting on a couch cushion. Though he had suffered many injuries, including lacerations and bruising, blunt force trauma on the left side of his face and on the back of his head, Dana's immediate cause of death was strangulation. He was 17 years old. The bodies were discovered by Sheila Sharp, Sue's daughter and Johnny's sister. 14-year-old Sheila had come home that morning from a sleepover at a neighbor's house. She walked through the front door of cabin number 28 and ran away screaming.
It remains one of California's most brutal homicides, but you may never have heard about it. Described as one night of horror and 20 years of mystery.
Tonight, Manuel Ramos takes us to the Northern California community haunted by this unsolved murder mystery.
It looks like any other abandoned cabin, condemned, run down. But cabin 28 is different. It has history, and if its rotting wood walls could talk, it would reveal a truly sinister tale. It all began on a Saturday night in April of 1981. Two teenagers, John Sharp and Dana Wingate, were seen hitchhiking from Quincy to the Keddie Resort 7 miles away. The mother of one of the teens, 36-year-old Glenna Sharp, was living in cabin number 28. When the boys knocked on the door, they walked into what can most certainly be described as pure hell.
Actually, there was blood everywhere. There was on the walls, on the floors. It was very, very brutal homicide scene.
The mother and two teens were found bound and gagged and beaten and stabbed.
They used like electrical cord that was at the location to bind the victims. They used butcher knives that were from the residence, and hammer. A hammer was used.
A homicidal frenzy of violence, according to Commander DeCrone.
They had actually stabbed the walls, and the instruments that they had used, they struck the victim so hard that the blades of the knives were actually bent back over themselves.
Here is footage of cabin 28 days after the victims were discovered. At the time of the murders, 3 boys were left unharmed in a side bedroom. 2 of them were Rick and Greg Sharp, who to this day state that they never saw anything in the cabin that night. The 3rd boy, Justin, was placed under hypnosis shortly after the murders in an attempt to jog his memory. In part 1 of this documentary, filmed in 2004, he had this to say about what he saw.
Based on statements that I have mentioned and interviews with the police, I believe that there's a very good chance that I had witnessed something, whether it be the crime itself or the aftermath. As a matter of fact, during some of the interviews with the police under hypnosis and speaking to them normal, if you will, I had indicated body placement, which were, from what I understand, very close to being correct, if not correct, as well as the mention of the rag being placed on the left breast, which is completely accurate. So therefore, based on that conclusion, it's highly likely that I did indeed see something.
These crimes came to be known as the Ketty murders, named after the once idyllic town where Sue, Johnny, and Dana were killed. At the time that Sheila Sharp discovered the bodies of her mother, brother, and his friend, she didn't know that her younger sister, 12-year-old Tina, had gone missing.
She's a girl of 12 years of age with shoulder-length hair. It's dark blonde in color, and she has light blue eyes. We're trying to locate Tina. We believe that she's an integral part of this, and that she may be the clue that we're looking for.
Tina's remains were discovered 3 years later in an isolated area 60 miles south of Ketty, known as Feather Falls. The murders of Sue, Johnny, Dana, and Tina remain unsolved to this day. The story of the Ketty murders has fascinated people for nearly 3 decades. Some insist that the Ketty resort is haunted by the spirits of the victims who died there. Before we knew how deeply this film would take us inside these crimes, we traveled to the home of Nancy Bowman, a psychic who lives in Northern California.
Usually it just hits me like a brick wall. You know, if it wants to come in, it'll come in. And it doesn't happen that often, but every now and then, if it's something that appears to be very important to the spirit, it'll come through so clearly, and I'll get all the emotions of it.
So what kinds of emotions or feelings have you gotten about the Ketty murders?
Horrific, sad, a lot of hiding. You know, there's one particular person that is in the picture, but people don't realize it. So, deceit, lying. The mother knew the men, not as close friends or that, but everybody there knew the men. And they were more transient. They got jobs when and where they can. And they were hired to do some handyman work around there. They were dirty. They're not healthy, dirty, druggy, alcohol. The one man has lighter hair, blonde, scruffy, bad teeth. And he's thin, very thin. And he's very sick, but he doesn't know it at that time. He didn't know it, but he's very sick. He's like a sociopath. You know, he does whatever he can to get his drugs, to manipulate people. He's a liar. The other fellow who's with him is dark. I see him more as Hispanic or something of that nature, darker skin, big green eyes, dark hair. I see him with a jean jacket, though, and a t-shirt, a regular t-shirt. But I see this other guy, and he's outside the cabin. And I'm getting chills on this one. I don't like this one. He's in a red flannel shirt with the black lines going through. And he has a name, and the initial is R. I can't quite get the whole name. And he's just watching. It's almost like it was a setup. And he's watching. He didn't want to get totally involved in it, but he had them do this.
After talking with Nancy, we arranged to have Sheila Sharp meet another psychic, Donna Raymond, in Ketty at the site where Cabin 28 once stood.
Are you okay? Okay. Your mom is here. She wants you to know that she loves you very much. But she doesn't want you coming here anymore. It's not safe for you. You need to stay away until you find out if you're okay. So you do me a favor and you don't come here anymore. Yeah? Sure. Okay. Well, I think she's right here so you can just talk to her. Sorry so much. I just wish she was here. I miss them all. I'm so sorry. Just my mom back. Come on, I rest.
During the investigation of the murders in 1981, the Plymouth County Sheriff's Office was contacted by several psychics who offered assistance in the case. They drew astrology charts to help locate Tina, sketches of potential suspects, and maps that might indicate where the killers lived. But there was more. Among the cassette tapes in the case files was this audio recording from a psychic out of Oakhurst, California.
When I turn to Dana, I get stabbing pain in the chest and on the left side of the back for some reason. A sense of a lot of pain in my arms, pulling pain, and also the left arm is quite painful. Get an image of a cluttered house, very cluttered, small rooms, and for some reason, kitchen chairs keep coming in. It's a word rather than an image, and yet I get a feeling of metal. And at one point, I see the young man, Dana, tied and pulled back on a chair, sitting. There's a feeling of him sitting at that point. And this is confusing to me because I've already been told by Doug that they were not tied to chairs. But were tied and on the floor. I keep getting a feeling that the assailants, and there are two assailants, actually came because of the son, John, and that there was something about drugs, something about him having ripped them off. That phrase came in several times. My perception of the assailants, the first man seems to be quite young. I would place him somewhere between 19 and 23, perhaps quite young. Brown hair, perhaps 5'10", muscular with sideburns. It feels as though he may have been trying to grow a beard. There seems to be some hair on his face, but it's not enough to call a beard. He may have just not shaved that day, or during the, say, 2 or 3 days prior to that. The second man seems to be somewhat older, I would say, somewhere between 28 and 32. Darker hair, very frizzy. I would say naturally curly so that it stands out a lot. Slender, perhaps not more than 140, 150 pounds, and perhaps as much as 6 feet tall. I'd say about 6 feet tall. He has rather swarthy skin, large pores. I feel that Tina knew the younger assailant. I also feel that that both of the boys knew the younger assailant, that he was in fact known to the family. When I turn to the mother, and I'm not certain at this point about her because I don't have anything really good to work with, but the only feeling I get from her is, from the photograph I have, is a lot of anger, feeling very resentful about her recent rejection, and really being rather overwhelmed with her family responsibilities. I feel that she was very much alone. Didn't have anyone she felt she could lean on. The girl Tina is very small, and from physical appearances, you would think she was very naive, and yet I get a sense of her being old beyond her years and experience beyond her years. I get a sense of her being sexually active, and then the next impression comes in is that perhaps she has been sexually abused or used over a period of time by an older person. There is a feeling of a lot of violence here, and especially with the two boys and the mother. I have a feeling of beating, brutality.
We wanted to find out more about Tina to see what might have led to her disappearance and death. This is Tanya Sherman, who was 18 years old at the time of the murders.
Little Tina was in elementary school. She was a student in a program at the school that I worked in. As a senior, I was in work experience, and I knew her from there. I had some interaction with her as I, at the time, started to date the teacher that was the special education teacher she was enrolled with. And I knew her very, pretty vaguely from that contact.
I asked Tanya if she thought that Tina might have been the intended target all along, if she thought that the assailants had gone to Cabinet 28 not to kill the family, but to abduct the young girl.
I think it's very possible, simply because she was the one that was missing for so long. And I don't know if she was taken from the residence alive or not. So I think that's very likely. It's a very likely possibility. I lean a little more towards maybe someone who knew Tina more personally. And, there is a possibility, I guess, that something was happening in the house with Tina and was then discovered by probably the mother. Maybe she was killed first, and then the boys did come home later, and maybe, it happened in a series of, 1, 2, 3, and then the individual left with Tina. She was 12, she was a cute little girl, she was very quiet, and I think she could have been the recipient of some sort of abuse, molestation, or something, sexual abuse going on. That would have caused a huge problem if the mother came home and discovered. I'm pretty directed at my own theory, and that this individual who I think about this has been charged with a sex offense on a small child since then.
To help us make this film, Plumas County Sheriff Greg Hagwood gave us access to the Ketty murders case files, including crime scene photos and interviews with the primary suspects. The sheriff's office is located in East Quincy, about 9 miles outside Ketty. Inside the office is a timeline of events surrounding the crime, boxes filled with cassette tapes and photos, and file cabinets overrun with information about the case. The teacher that Tanya referred to had joined in the search for Tina Sharp. He told police that he was very fond of Tina, that it was not unusual for her to sit on his lap and be affectionate. The police could find no concrete evidence linking him to the murders or to the girl's disappearance. In addition to the report about Tina's teacher, we found an interview conducted between Tina and the sheriff's office. Several months before the murders and Tina's disappearance, the 12-year-old had been molested by a man who lived in Quincy. In the police reports that followed the homicides, many suspected that this man might have committed the murders, with Tina as his primary target. Adding to the mystery was this FBI profile of the Ketty murder suspect, written by John Douglas, in which Douglas states that the killer was motivated by his love for Tina Sharp. When Tina's remains were discovered by a bottle collector in Feather Falls in 1984, she was brought to Dr. Tiran Murad for possible identification. We hoped Dr. Murad could tell us more about her discovery and how she died.
I remember the officer that I was just alluding to, who was a Butte County Sheriff's Department deputy at that time. His name was Tom Handy. And Tom had come to me in our old lab, it's in another building. He'd come to me with the skull and asked me if I'd look at it. Of course I did. I always accepted. I never turned anybody, they asked for help, I'll provide it, it's no problem. But in looking at it, he wanted me to tell him that it was prehistoric. Because it was prehistoric, that meant that it wasn't going to be further investigated. They would return it to the local Native American group. Okay? And so that would mean there would be no investigation, everything would be over. But I assured him that it was not prehistoric, it was a modern individual. And to his surprise, I said that it was a child. And I told Tom that I thought that it was a child about 11 and a half, 12 years old. And I ended up writing a report on the skull. Because the skull's in such good shape, by that I mean it wasn't badly eroded, it hadn't been sitting in the sun, it never really looked as though it had been buried at all. Okay? I encouraged him to go back to where it was found and look for more bone. And in fact, a couple of days later, while we returned to this, I think it was a Boy Scout camp near the Feather Falls in Butte County. So at this time, this was a Butte County case, and we couldn't find anything. She'd been chewed by rodents. Given where she was found, I suspect it may have been squirrels or something like that. It's hard to know exactly what kind of damage was done, what animals did it. But there was no evidence of blunt force trauma or any sharp force trauma, nothing that suggested she'd been stabbed or bludgeoned. There was nothing that could suggest the cause of death. And one of the questions we're asked is, what is the post-mortem interval? How long had she been dead, or how long had these remains been out? That's very, very difficult to answer, given the fact that we were working with bone. Okay, there was no grease on this skull, and there was no odor. And part of it looked as though that it laid on the surface of the ground, and I could tell which side was down because it was stained by the dirt. And the other side was exposed to more sunlight. It was kind of bleached out. My own experience with that is it would take about a year, maybe two at the most, for the skull to reach that kind of condition. Okay? And so in my report, I said that I thought that she had been dead perhaps a year, maybe a year and a half, possibly even two. And so when word of that was leaked out or was obtained by people in the community, they got really upset. I can understand why. Because the family had been killed, as I say, maybe 3 or 4 years earlier, and now her skull was found, and I was saying that she might have been dead for a year or two. So people began to wonder if whether or not she had been, retained, kidnapped, and kept alive for some length of time. And I don't think that that was the case, because as I recall, I've forgotten now specifically, but I think she was like 12 years old when she died. Okay, and she looked essentially 11 and a half or 12 to me. So that if that were the case, I think she was killed very, very soon after she died. This particular case was interesting because it was in fact a child. And all the children that I've worked on, okay, I remember them very specifically because they are children. These people died far too young. They each, they would have had a story to tell. They would have had a life in front of them where they would have become parents themselves and worried about their own children, I'm sure. And just too bad that they were taken from everyone at such a young age, because they really represent a degree of innocence and an unfulfilled dream.
We wondered if Sue Sharp had discovered that someone was hurting Tina. We turned our attention to a list of residents who lived in Keddie at the time of the murders to see if any one of them had known Sue or had interacted with her. Frank Davis lived in cabin 13. He had moved out 10 days before the murders took place. He asked that we not show his face on camera.
If you were looking directly at cabin 28, I lived to the left of her. The house there with the porch all the way around it. Lucky number 13. There was like a Chevy Blazer, a white Chevy Blazer, and a guy that looked like Avery Shriver. Now, I don't know if you remember Avery Shriver. He was a comedian back in the early 60s and 70s. Real dark, frizzy hair, kind of heavy set, Greek looking. And she was constantly fighting with this guy, arguing, yelling and screaming, back and forth, back and forth.
Who's the she?
Mrs. Sharp. I don't know what her first name was. And I'd see the kids around and whatnot, but, you know, I'd say good morning and nobody'd say anything. So I just learned not to speak to them. They got into several, you know, motherfucker, son of a bitch, you bastard mother. And I mean, yelling, screaming, you hear shit crashing, throwing stuff. And I thought, well, I'm kind of glad I'm moving, you know. It usually started out low and built up in crescendo, and sooner or later, she would throw him out, or he'd stomp out, and the door would slam, and he'd go out and jump in his blazer and tear off down the road. You know, it was domestic squabbles, basically.
Frank provided this information to the police, and a report was made. But the man who fought with Sue had seemingly disappeared from Ketty after the murders and was never located.
There was enough going back and forth between them, and those fights were violent enough that, you know, he could have been mad enough to go after her with a hammer. You know, people on cocaine do weird shit. I've always believed it was drug related. I think that whoever killed that lady had a real mad going. And they were either emotionally mad